Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Michelle Moore. She's a professor of English at the College of DuPage, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Moore is a member of the Willa Cather Foundation, the Hemingway Society, the Faulkner Society, the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society. She gives papers and attends conferences on these things, and she's published in Literature and Film Quarterly. Dr. Moore, what's the connection between these authors that you're studying and Chicago? Because I know that's what your book is about, right?
Right. Well, my book is titled Chicago and the Making of American Modernism. And then the subtitle, which tells a little more information, is Cather, Hemingway, Faulkner, and Fitzgerald in Conflict. And so my book thinks about what the relationship is of Chicago literature, which really was American literature at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, the relationship of that to these big modernist writers that everyone's really heard of, and most people who have any interest in reading have read at least a short story by.
Yeah.
And these writers, I believe, are in conflict with what they perceived as the original American literature, which was Chicago literature.
Chicago Modernism, it was called initially, right?
Well, it was a Chicago realism.
Oh, realism, okay, realism, yeah.
Because
okay.
modernism had not washed ashore in the U.S. yet from Europe.
Okay. So this realism movement in Chicago was kind of the starting point for a lot of these authors, and they moved away from it at some point. But the authors that did move away from it, who you're also interested in, are people like...
So the first generation are people like William Dean Howells, who was the big critic in Massachusetts, who said, realism will be American literature.
Yeah.
And Henry James is the best example of it.
Sure. And then Upton Sinclair at some point, right?
Right.
Represents this. And I guess if we move through this historically, we end up with Studs Terkel, right? Still writing in that tradition.
We do. We go right through the Studs Terkel, and right along the way, we'll have a writer like Henry Blake Fuller, who will write alongside and with the Columbian Exhibition. Mm-hmm. And Howells will say he's the best American writer. He is the best inheritor of the Henry James tradition. Yeah. And so Fuller is the Chicago writer that then links Chicago with realism and with what Howells says is American literature, because there hadn't been an American literature before this moment. Right. And then from there, if you wanted to be an American writer, this is how you wrote. This is what you wrote. You imitated.
And so these other authors, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, they were distinguishing themselves by kind of stepping away from that a little bit then? Is that what we're saying?
Exactly, and because they're younger, Faulkner's born in 1897, Hemingway's born in 1899, you want to do something different than the previous generation. Right. Every young generation wants to do something different. And so they were also right there at the period where the European modernist writers were starting to really make a splash. Joyce writes Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, 1915. Gertrude Stein is in Paris, and she has her salon going where she's inviting great artists like Matisse and Picasso, who aren't those great artists yet. And all of this you have to go to Europe for. It hadn't quite splashed into the US yet until the Armory Show in 1913. And that show in 1913, which begins in New York, and then the curator of the Art Institute of Chicago, the curator of the Fine Arts Museum in Boston, those two curators split it, so we actually get more than 50%. We get 70% here in Chicago of the original Armory Show in New York. And that was the first time that most citizens in Chicago saw European modernist art. Yeah. And everyone was in it that you could imagine. And you can imagine, too, what kind of an influence that would have, just bringing the modernist art from Europe over to America, on writers who were essentially teenagers reading about this in the newspaper. This was it. This was where it was at. And yet, they're American, and where it was at in America was realist art. So now you have a tension between those two kinds of arts emerging.
Yeah. Interesting. And what is it about the nature of Chicago that sponsored this? Would you like to speculate on that a little bit? I think of Chicago as Carl Sandburg, one of the, probably a member of this movement, right? Talking about the city of big shoulders, and Chicago at one point, their motto was the city that works. It's a very unpretentious city. Let's talk about that. What do you think?
Well, Chicago, unpretentious is a good word for it, but yeah, Chicago is fascinating. Chicago is so unique. And in large part because there was, that fire, right?
Yeah.
That takes the city to the ground and is still so much a part of the imagination of who Chicago is and who we are, who live in Chicago and work in Chicago and around Chicago.
Why? Because it was a slap in the face that said, "Wake up, everybody! Let's look at the basic things here." And
well, actually, it was because we rebuilt. Chicago rebuilt.
Yeah.
And an entire folklore, lore builds up around rebuilding Chicago.
Okay.
So Chicago burns to the ground, and immediately the newspapers begin to publish pictures of everything lost except wife and children. We'll start rebuilding tomorrow. And so that work ethic, the city that works, begins in those days, months, years, rebuilding after the fire. Yeah. And it's a propaganda campaign that Chicago will rebuild, is rebuilding, and will be a better city than you can even imagine it was before it burnt to the ground or any city that exists. And those who had the money here, people like Potter Palmer, people who would form the Chicago Club, really put forth this idea as they traveled east, pulled on every connection that they had in order to bring money into Chicago, not just to rebuild, but to get the Columbian exhibition.
Right.
And so they got it, of course, and they were able to then use the Columbian exhibition to showcase how not only how quickly Chicago could rebuild, but how well we could rebuild.
Yeah. It's interesting about the Columbian Exposition that there's so many remnants of it that are still laying around. I live in Joliet, and there are places where somebody has some pillars from one of the buildings in the on display in their yard or something, and I've known about it since I was a kid. Why was that so important? Just because we were rebuilding, because it was a statement of having accomplished something, or was it more than that?
Because the narratives about Chicago that Chicagoans are going to tell themselves and still do today begin during this period.
Yeah.
And some of those narratives are that you speak well of Chicago.
Yeah.
You have to boost the city out of the swamp, out of the ashes.
Yeah.
And you use everything available to you in order to do so.
And this is what influences the writers, right?
Very much so.
Yeah.
And so when William Dean Howells is writing that the American literature is the Chicago literature, there is a cry from both the wealthy industrialists of Chicago and the newspaper critics, the new generation of newspaper critics that, yay, we're on the map. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
It's boosting Chicago in an art sense, and the art scene is boosting. But the artists in Chicago, like Henry Blake Fuller, like then Harriet Monroe, who are the young artists at the time, began to bristle, and Fuller writes a long diatribe about this, that art should not be used simply as a booster for business in Chicago.
Right. And a valid point that people get confused today, I think. Another connection in terms of Chicago realism, I'm thinking, is Chicago journalism. And I think you talk a little bit about the muckrakers and this being basically a Chicago movement, essentially. Can we go into that a little bit?
Yes. So the muckraking journalism is the journalist equivalent of realism, where we lay everything out on the table in order to critique and to expose corruption. So if Chicago becomes the literary capital of America, which it had been by this point, then
and this is, let's do those years again so
okay.
people understand. So it ascends to this position, basically as the first city like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Approximately
1885, 1888-ish.
Through,
well, there's those who would say today, right?
yeah, well, today, but
my book argues...
If I'm not from the Chicago area, what would I say?
Well, what happens is the writers drain off, which is what I argue and show in my book.
And that's what happens in the 20s.
Right, they drain off in the
1920s.
20s. They leave to go to New York, to go to Europe, where it's at. And there is, though, a bit of return at that point, where in the 30s and the 40s, women of color, writers who were not getting their due when Chicago was dominating the American literary scene, begin to come into fruition. And so then you have another flowering of what's been termed the Chicago Renaissance at that point. I'm most interested in that period in between.
Yeah. So a lot of things are coming together here. Mm-hmm. What about the printing industry in Chicago? I also know Chicago was kind of known as a printing center. Did that lend anything to this?
Absolutely. If you're able to print books, you're able to control the flow of them, right?
Yeah.
And so who is being published then in Chicago will begin to matter more and more.
Yeah. So a couple of things that you address in your work. Why did so many significant writers and artists leave Chicago when they started leaving? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that pushback that Harriet Monroe was doing with the committee is really the beginning of it. She'll form a small group called the Little Room with Henry Blake Fuller in the 1880s, and it's the first small artist salon. They had a loft in the Fine Arts building.
Yeah.
And they really were at the center of the fine arts scene, and they developed their little room as a place where artists could band together. And I argue it's sort of an artists' union at the time, that we need to see the union movement against this. They all believed that artists needed to push back against the boosterism, push back against those industrialists who wanted to use their art in order to forward their own interests and the interests of Chicago. So
plus, there was the fact, I think, that a lot of artists and intellectuals kind of felt like they were slumming if they were in Chicago, right?
Well, that's going to start to happen, right?
Yeah.
And that's Hemingway, that's the generation of Hemingway. That's the generation of even his mentor, Sherwood Anderson. And the publishers of magazines like The Little Review, Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson, who will leave Chicago as soon as they're able to, because they felt too much pushback when they were here.
Yeah.
They couldn't raise funds to do the kind of new art that they wanted to.
Wasn't Poetry Magazine published in Chicago, the magazine that discovered T.S. Eliot, right? I think that's a...
Yes, it was.
How does that fit into all this?
Well, Harriet Monroe made it.
Okay.
And Harriet Monroe begins Poetry Magazine in 1915. And on the first page of her first issue of the magazine, she puts out a manifesto for poets and for all artists that she will publish all art and all poetry that is doing something new, different, and interesting, and it is not for her to judge where it will be in 100 years.
Right.
And so that is a kind of manifesto pushing back against, we need to just publish one kind of art, this realistic art. Yeah.
And eventually she publishes Let Us Go Then, You and I, When the Evening is Spread Out Against the Sky. Right?
Yes, she does.
Some very famous poems. You also talk about why some of these writers write such scathing critiques of Chicago. Right? Tell us about that.
Well, the scathing critiques come because of the way in which Chicago will blend money-making with art, and that art at the highest level has to be in some sense supported not just in patronage, but by a industrialist, by industry. And so what really was the seed of the book for me was Cather's Song of the Lark. And in that, she tells the story of a young girl who begins on the plains and has talent. She is first a pianist, and then she develops her voice as an opera singer. She comes to Chicago to get training, and there is a very dark center to the book where when she's in Chicago, she meets up with the right people through her teacher who begin to lift her to the higher and higher levels of the opera world. Now, Cather's drawing on some older stories here in which real artists either married well or met up with industrialists, and then they were able to lift to higher levels. This is the Citizen Kane story, right?
Yeah.
But Cather is critiquing this. On the one hand, her heroine she writes of her heroine as really developing her voice and getting to where she ought to be. On the other hand, we can see the mechanizations going on behind the scenes that even her protagonist doesn't know. And on the third level, her protagonist becomes darker and darker and sicker as this is happening, which is a critique of it.
Yeah.
That this blending of business and art is not for Cather a good thing, and she will write in so many different ways throughout her career, in every place from letters to other work, that art should be something in its own space.
Art for art's sake.
Art for art's sake, which is the modernist credo, and that is right where Cather is showing herself as a modernist and not a Chicago writer.
Well, that conflict is with it's everywhere, right? I mean, It wasn't just in Chicago, but somehow Chicago came to represent that, I guess. But I think about Hollywood today, right? I mean, how many times have you heard directors and actors and actresses complain that they had to compromise themselves because of the mechanisms of the money and the machinery in Hollywood, right?
Well, that's exactly it. But the first push of how art and business must be intertwined is in Chicago.
Yeah.
And it is in Chicago that it is still most intertwined. You don't have that allowance for art's sake quite the way that you do in other places.
Yeah. Well, although, it seems to be more prevalent every day, in the 21st century here,
Right.
Photographers are, they become photographers because they're interested in art, but they end up shooting weddings so they can make money, right? Well, what are some of the other areas that you covered in your book?
Well, because this work is so rooted in the archive, there were so many interesting things that just sort of end up being uncovered. This is how we do original research in the humanities. You go into the archives and they bring out the boxes that are, this big and packed, and you sit and spend hours and days and weeks just going through everything, hoping, fingers crossed, that it will do something, that narrative will be found.
Yeah.
And along the way, sometimes you're lucky enough to find little things here and there that change the way that you're thinking about your subject.
Yeah. And you found a few gems, I take it.
I did. I did. One of the most exciting finds was when I was doing research at the JFK Library in Boston, which houses all of Hemingway's, most of Hemingway's work, I should say. The archive, all of his letters, all of the correspondence, everything. And it's a very much a fascinating place on its own. But when you're doing archival work, you're always fighting the clock. You're always up against time. There's never enough time to see everything that you want to see. And then you're also fighting your own experience of fatigue, right, as a day after day of this. And so I'm there the first day, and I'm looking through boxes and letters, and you have to take a break, but you don't want to take a break, but you have to. So
and they probably don't let you bring your shake in with you, right?
Absolutely not.
No.
And so we all have different ways as researchers to deal with that moment. And I have some friends who what they do is they start to go through the photographs, right? That's a different kind of thinking. Yeah. Well, the thing that I do is I always start to go through the stuff lists. And what I mean is the things that are in the archives that are not papers, right? Like, well, what kind of stuff do they have from Hemingway's house, right, or from his home? And what they have in Boston is Hemingway's book collection that was bequeathed along with the rest of the archive by Mary, his fourth wife.
Yeah.
And so that in itself is a fascinating thing, that you can look at every book that was in his library upon his death.
Yeah.
And so I started looking, and I noticed there was a book by someone named Hemingway that Ernest had not written. And I thought, there's another writer in the family now. I knew there had been a painter, that was his mother, and there's painters and other artists, but I didn't know what this was.
Yeah.
And it was a book called How to Make Good. Well, I immediately asked to see the actual book, to see the archivist, because it had a copyright date on it of 1915.
Yeah.
Well, Hemingway was born in 1899, so that means this came out when he was 16. So whose book is this?
Yeah.
Well, I could see it was his uncle's, Uncle Tyler, who he went to live with in St. Louis after graduating college. Still didn't know anything about this book, had never come across it or heard about it in any of the biographies. Asked for it. Now, you have to request, and you have to have your request approved. So I'm waiting day after day to have the request approved. Each day I go to lunch, I come back and I say, has it been approved? We're still waiting on it. Okay.
Like they were checking with Hemingway.
Exactly.
We're waiting for him to get back to us.
They're conjuring up the ghost of Hemingway, right? And so then we're waiting, and so finally I come back from lunch. It's been approved. Tomorrow you can see it after lunch. So of course the next day I take the quickest lunch I've ever had, right? And I go back, and the archivist, the assistant says, "What is it?" And I said, "Well, let me look and I'll tell you." And I had a theory, and I opened it up, and you have to do this carefully on the apparatus they give you. I open it up and I look at the title page, and it was inscribed from his Uncle Tyler to Ernest, 1917.
Wow.
Which is the date of his high school graduation.
Wow.
So I found his high school graduation present from his favorite uncle.
Yeah. And something that might have influenced him maybe more than some of those other books.
Well,
right?
that's what I argue.
Yeah.
Because not only was this his graduation present, remember all the books came upon his death.
Yeah.
So he had kept it his entire life. Yeah. And this was a book that the binding was worn, and not just from age, the pages had been turned. So I believe very strongly that this is the book that he referred to throughout his entire life. And it was a book on how to make good as a businessman.
Interesting.
So
Hemingway, of course, being from Chicago, which is why you're studying him, I'm sure, right?
Precisely.
And here we're back to that theme again.
Exactly, and back to business.
Yeah.
So if you want to learn, as young Ernie Hemingway did, to connect business and art, well, he's got a manual here about how to be a good businessman.
Yeah.
And so then I threw out everything I'd written before for that chapter and began to consider and think about how Hemingway constructed himself as a businessman, for better and worse, and how that conflicts with his own visions of what it meant to be a modernist artist.
That's fascinating, and that's very parallel with this story in Gatsby about how Nick, after Gatsby's been killed, finds this diary or something that he wrote, and and he's got these notes in there on how he's going to live his life and everything, right? And that it fits the whole story together for you all of a sudden.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
And Hemingway and Fitzgerald were good friends. I use the word friends sometimes carefully when I'm dealing with these relationships, but they were quite good friends. And Hemingway thought Fitzgerald was the best writer of the generation. The problem was the drinking for Hemingway, that Fitzgerald drank too much.
Yeah.
And so he wasn't able to blossom. But when Fitzgerald is good, he's really good.
Yeah.
And so it's not surprising to see those parallels.
I recently discovered that The Great Gatsby was not not reviewed very well when it came out.
Right.
Was that because it was so contrary to this this style of realism that was still dominant at the time?
Well, Chicago had lost its hold as the literary center in the U.S. at this time.
Yeah.
But I think you're onto something with that. There's some, I absolutely, that it's too much of a critique.
Yeah.
For many people now, you can see that Gatsby is too much of a critique of a capitalist system, which when he writes it in 1926 is in full force, right? And it is very much a critique and a kind of realist critique.
Oh, you think so? Yeah, okay, interesting. But the
Yes.
style isn't the style of realism, I guess is what I was getting at, but yeah.
Well, if realism is first a critique,
Yeah, okay.
then if you can find critique, then that's where you're seeing him working with it. But yet Fitzgerald was interested in modernism, and he loved Joyce, and he loved the interesting output that was happening in Europe. So he also was trying to figure out how to meld these two styles together.
Yeah. Very good. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Michelle Moore for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.